I looked at the natural world, and it seemed to share my feelings, to be trying in vain to escape its approaching doom. The waves of the sea sped in disorderly flight towards the horizon. The seabirds, the dolphins, and flying fish hurtled frenziedly through the air. The islands trembled and grew transparent, endeavouring to detach themselves, to rise up as vapour and vanish in space. But no escape was possible. The defenceless earth could only lie in wait for its destruction, either by avalanches of fire or by chain explosions which would go on and on, eventually transforming it into a nebula, its very substance disintegrated. Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're talking about one of the strangest books that I have read so far this year. That is Anna Kavan's Ice, published in 1967. Part 1. Summary. Ice is set during an apocalypse in which a monolithic ice shelf caused by nuclear war is slowly engulfing the Earth. An unnamed male narrator traverses this dangerous landscape in pursuit of a young, nameless woman, contemplating his conflicting violent and loving feelings he has towards her as the world freezes around him. Frustrating his pursuit is a man named the Warden, the girl's husband and captor. Part 2. An Icy Fever Dream. So this is an incredibly difficult book to follow. The plot is basically threadbare, there isn't really much of a plot, and many of the events that do happen in the book are called into doubt constantly throughout the course of the novel. Even though it's only about 150 pages long, it does take a lot of work and concentration to get through it, because otherwise you just lose where you are in the novel, as I did several times when I was reading it. It's also a difficult novel to classify. On the one hand, it seems to be a sci-fi dystopian novel. It's got an apocalypse of ice, that's the whole backdrop of the thing, but then at the same time there are certain subtle hints in the novel that suggest that maybe the ice isn't actually there, and that this is actually a manifestation of mental illness on the part of the narrator. And the ice is essentially a symbolic metaphor of the mental illness that is clouding him or crushing him. According to its Wikipedia page, ice is classified sometimes as fantasy, sometimes as sci-fi, but often as slipstream, which is a genre that blends elements of fantasy, elements of sci-fi, and elements of literary fiction all together. This makes sense when you consider that a lot of the fantastical elements might not actually be there and may just be hallucinations. However, I am classifying this book as fantasy, at least for the purposes of this channel and my classification of books, because I think it's a good example of how a novel can use fantastical elements, even if they are, in this case, hallucinatory, and use them in such a way that does something really cool and really interesting. There are certainly a lot of people who tend to look down on fantasy as a lesser genre, but I think Ice is a novel that really proves those people wrong and shows how fantasy can be used to do many interesting things. In this case, talking about mental illness, but also perhaps the treatment of mentally ill patients by society, and also the treatment of women by men, and nature by human beings. For me, the enjoyment of this book came not really from reading it, especially the first time, but from trying to work out what was going on in the book. As I said, many passages of the book are called into doubt because of the unreliable narrator that we follow. There are several parts of the novel where the woman is being pursued by the man, and then she'll just vanish, or she'll even seem to die in some cases, and it'll be pretty obvious or clear that she seems to have died, but then she's back again in another scene, so you don't know whether he's just seeing lots of women who look like this woman that he's obsessed with, or whether he's just hallucinating, killing her sometimes. It's so hard to focus on what is going on. There are also a couple of parts where, although most of the novel is told from a first-person narration by this male, there are parts where it switches from this first-person narration into a third-person narrator that focuses on the girl's perspective. And as a reader, again, it's not clear whether this is genuine switching of person, or whether it's a dream that the narrator is having that he's describing in an ambiguous way. A final ambiguity in the novel that I found was with the character of the Warden, who is meant to be the villain, at least as far as the narrator is concerned. There are strong hints in the novel that the narrator and the Warden are actually the same person. In fact, there's a passage where the narrator pretty much describes him as a mirror reflection or a brother, and it seems to me that this might suggest that perhaps the Warden is a manifestation of the narrator's cruel side and his abuse to this girl, and he kind of creates this persona, the Warden, as the oppressor, so that he doesn't have to take responsibility for the way he treats this woman himself. These are just some of the things, some of the ambiguities and things to unpack with this novel, and I could talk about them for days, and it was definitely really interesting to talk about this in my book club, which is when I was introduced to this book by one of my friends in that club. I'm not going to get too bogged down into interpretation stuff, because I do want to keep these videos relatively short, But there's just a sense there of all the possible ways of interpreting this book, and all the things to think about. What I will say though is that in terms of the reading experience, if you don't bear that stuff that I mentioned in mind, you might actually find this book a bit dull or just too difficult to really get into or understand. I certainly did the first time I read it. I wasn't really that enamored by it. I thought the narrator was just too horrible of a person, it was too confusing, it was too weird. But then when I finished the book and reflected on it in order to make this review and for my book club, I actually found there was so much substance there, and now there are just so many things that I can talk about. So I think going into it, if you bear these things in mind, these themes, these ambiguities, then you'll probably get a much more appreciation from the book than if you just go into it blind. I'll also talk a bit more about this in the third part of this video when I talk about Anna Kavan herself, because her life is very interesting, and if you get a sense of her life, it might also help you appreciate where this book is coming from. Part 3. Crazy characters. So if you're the sort of person who, with a book, you like to have a protagonist that's likeable and that you can identify with and all that kind of stuff, you're probably not going to enjoy this book very much. The only one character in the book that we have real insight into that we can somewhat trust is the narrator himself, and he's a pretty much a horrible person. Most of his psychology and the things that he thinks of are fixated on this girl, and his emotions towards her range from devotion to wanting to snap her wrists off at one point, fantasizing about seeing her dead, murdering her. It's pretty abusive. He's a pretty nasty human being. I think the inconsistencies in the way that the narrator feels towards the girl throughout the novel, and the way he seems incapable of focusing on anything consistent about his feelings to her or the world around him, shows us how unstable he is and how unreliable he is as a narrator. Now, despite not being particularly likeable because of all this, it does mean that he's a very fascinating narrator, because as a reader, you have to do a lot of thinking and work for yourself to work out what is going on, what's true, what's not true, all that fun stuff. So if you do like those relatable characters, you won't find them here, but if you do like a book that you can dig deep into and you like a complex or crazy character, then the narrator of this book is definitely one of the best of that archetype. I mean, I've never come across a narrator that's this unhinged before, and this hard to understand. The only other two characters that we get to spend a lot of time with are the warden and the girl. And our views of this are obviously filtered through the narrator, so it's kind of hard to know what exactly about them is true and what is false. I already suggested that the warden may just be a manifestation of the narrator himself, but if we don't accept that interpretation, then the warden is pretty much just a cruel tyrant who abuses his wife, the girl. There's not much else to his character other than that. The girl, on the other hand, is more interesting, because although on the one hand, the narrator often perceives her as this weak victim, and he describes her as like a glass girl who, very fragile, that kind of stuff, there are moments in the story where she shows a certain amount of strength and resilience, and they always seem to unnerve or shock the narrator, almost like he's been shocked back into reality. And I think these little nuggets tell us something about the girl, that she's actually someone who, while yes, she's being pursued by a terrible person, is not some damsel in distress. She's resilient, she's angry, and she rebukes him throughout the novel. We only get these hints though, we don't know for sure if that's really her, or again if it's just fantasy, because the narration is so jarring and messy and dreamlike. But it does seem that with the girl there's this ambiguity there in her character, because on the one hand the narrator often likes to present her as being this fragile, weak thing, but then at the other hand you have these scenes where she comes across not in that way at all. There's a really good scene at the end where she even seems to tease and bully the narrator when he finally catches up to her. And again, if that's the kind of character she is, she can't just be a weak victim. So this is a great thing as a reader to delve into and dig into, especially when you've read the book a couple of times and you can pay attention more and see what might be real and what might not be. So when it comes to characters, if you do like a very strongly built character or set of characters where it's quite clear what their motivations are, what their archetypal characteristics are, all that kind of stuff, then you might not find much to like in this book. That being said, if you just like or are interested in off-the-wall crazy characters with lots of ambiguities going on and all that kind of stuff, then you will really enjoy this. For me, I did find it displeasurable to read, especially with the narrator, because of the cruel things that he does and says. It's just uncomfortable, and it's also not got a lot of humour in it. It's just pretty dark most of the time. So it was hard to read. But then, as I said before, when I think about the novel in the abstract and when I've gone back and reread it, I actually found these characters way more fascinating. because although they may not be fully drawn out in an obvious way, there is lots of intricate detail going on and lots to work out with them. So there still is a lot of complexity, even if it's not the usual type of complexity that you might expect with strong characters. Part 4. Anna Kavan. In trying to understand what Ice might be about, and in trying to appreciate it when you first read it, I think it's worth knowing a bit about Anna Kavan's life. So what I'm going to do now is read a little summary that I've written based on the notes and bits that I have, knowledge of her life, and hopefully these will help you going into the book get a sense for what it might be about and appreciate it more. Kavan was born as Helen Emily Woods in 1901 to a wealthy British family which she remembered to be lonely and neglected. Her father committed suicide when she was 10 years old in 1911. Though she wished to go to Oxford, Kavan's mother arranged an encounter with her former lover, Donald Ferguson, whom she married in 1920. Around this time she began to write novels, and apparently took up heroin to improve her tennis playing. Now, just as a pause, I don't understand how heroin would make you good at tennis, but if any of you know that, let me know in the comments, because why? Apparently she referred to her syringe as her bazooka. Kavan divorced Ferguson and married an artist named Stuart Edmonds. Over the next 5 years, Kavan published conventional novels and had a daughter named Margaret, who died soon after childbirth. When Kavan's marriage ended in 1938, she attempted suicide and was admitted to a clinic in Switzerland, starting a series of hospitalizations and asylum incarcerations throughout her life for both her depression and her lifelong heroin addiction. In the 1940s, Kavan's writing style shifted, and she changed her name to Anna Kavan, a character from one of her earlier novels. In 1967, she published Ice, her most commercially successful novel. Kavan died of heart failure in 1968, aged 67. So, quite an interesting life, quite an eccentric lady, and quite a change from her earlier work to when she published Asylum Piece in 1940, but then especially Ice. Her earlier novels were much more conventional and not massively popular, whereas Ice was just a complete 180 and completely different from the stuff she was writing before. Also, I do think this provides us with some insight into the meaning of Ice itself. Some people have argued that the girl in the novel is actually a stand-in for Kavan herself, and there are definitely some similarities between the character of the girl and Kavan herself. First of all, Kavan's relationship with her mother was pretty strained and I don't think very good. I think her mother was not particularly loving mother, and this is reflected in something that we hear about the girl in the novel. We hear that her mother treated her and abused her when she was a child, making her into a victim, which is why the male characters in the novel feel entitled to treat her as a victim because she was raised to be a victim. Also, Ferguson seemed to have very troubled relationships with the men in her life, not to mention her psychological issues. The psychological issues for some are represented by the ice that's pursuing and entrapping the girl. The men are then the representations of the men who are pursuing her and abusing her in her real life. And possibly the character of the warden could be someone in a psychological context, maybe someone at a clinic that she worked at. I think that because of the name warden, it seems to kind of make me think of someone who works at a clinic or an asylum, and maybe that's what that is. I don't know exactly, but there does seem to be something here about maybe this is a metaphor for mental illness and the abuses that Kavan has suffered in her real life. Not everyone likes that interpretation. Some people don't think it's autobiographical in that way, but I do think that it's a worthwhile interpretation, and again, knowing that stuff about Kavan's life definitely allowed me to appreciate this book a lot more and understand where she was coming from. This is someone who with severe depression throughout her life, severe heroin addict, and it just kind of all makes sense when you have that context. Part 5, Conclusion. As I said in the introduction, this is definitely one of the strangest things I've ever read. Probably up there with The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman by Angela Carter. What else? I can't think of anything else off the top of my head, but it's very similar to that book in the sense that it has that very surreal, crazy, off-the-wall writing style. Although this is definitely even harder to follow than that book by miles. It's basically, just mad. That being said, I do think it's a very fascinating novel, and if you're willing to give it some patience and some time, and you don't mind reading some pretty disturbing stuff, then I think you will find a lot to appreciate here. Whether you're a lover of fantasy, dystopia, sci-fi, or just literary fiction, I do think that if you're the sort of person with a bit of a bee in your bonnet when it comes to novels that invoke fantasy, give Ice a try, because I think it will be a nice gateway drug into recognising that fantasy isn't necessarily just kind of fluff. It's actually a great genre with lots of interesting things to say just like literary fiction is. If I was to point some weaknesses out very briefly, it would just be that it is hard to get into and it's a lot of work, even though it's very short. And like I said, the first time I read it, I didn't get it or appreciate it. It was only after thinking about it and talking about it with people that I came to appreciate it. And now I think if I read it again, I might find even more things and it might become one of my favourites of the year. Okay, that's it for today's video. Sorry for being a bit inconsistent of late. My personal life has been a bit all over the place, but luckily I think we're back on track now, so I can get to one video a week and it should all be good. So, jolly good. Please let me know in the comments what you think of Ice, if you've read it, and if you haven't read it, read it and then come and let me know what you think about it. I post new videos every Monday at 4 PM UK time, so if you're interested in getting updates, please consider subscribing to my channel. Take care guys, and I'll see you all in the next video.